My name is Meredith Calloway. I'm 42 years old and I run the finance department at Prescott Memorial Hospital, which mostly means I spend my days explaining budgets to surgeons who don't want to hear about budgets. I'm good at my job because I notice things other people miss. A decimal in the wrong place, a line item that doesn't match the invoice, a pattern that only shows up once you've been staring at the numbers long enough. I didn't know on the Tuesday in March when my mother called to tell me about the gallery show that I would end up using that same skill on my own family. "You should see it, Mary," she said. Her voice had that bright, brittle cheer she uses when she's proud of something she hasn't quite decided how she feels about yet. The Wren Gallery downtown. They did a whole exhibit on family archives and they used a photo of our wall. Our actual wall. They're calling it iconic. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and a dish towel in my hand, and I felt something cold settle low in my stomach, the way it does when a number in a spreadsheet doesn't add up and you already suspect why. "Which wall, Mom?" "The photo wall. In the hallway." "You remember." I remembered it perfectly. 31 years of Calloway family photographs, floor to ceiling, in mismatched frames my mother had collected from thrift stores because she said matching frames were for people without a real family. I had walked past that wall every day of my childhood. My high school graduation was on that wall. My first wedding, was on that wall until it wasn't. "Can you send me a picture?" I asked. She did 20 minutes later, and I sat down at my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. The wall was full. It was, if I was being honest, beautiful. My mother had always had an eye for arrangement, and the gallery's photographer had caught the light coming through the hallway window just right, gold and soft on all those frames. I was not in a single one of them. Not my graduation photo. Not my wedding photo, the second one, the good one, the one where Tom is laughing at something just out of frame. Not the photo of me holding Lily an hour after she was born. Not one single photograph of me at any age existed anywhere on that wall. I had been erased so cleanly that a professional curator had looked at the result and called it a masterpiece. That was the day I stopped being the daughter who let things go. Before I go further, I want to say if you're new here, welcome. I tell true, slow-building stories about families, money, and the quiet moments where people decide who they really are. Not everything gets fixed by the end, but sometimes things get honest, and honest is worth more than most people think. If that sounds like your kind of story, stay a while. I read every comment, and if this story reminds you of something in your own life, I'd like to hear it. Now let me take you back to where this really started, long before any gallery, long before any wall. Where the wall began. My parents, Richard and Joan Calloway, bought the house on Larkspur Street in 1981, 2 years before I was born and 6 years before my sister Denise came along. My brother Paul was born in between in 1984, which made him the one who never quite fit anywhere. Too young to be the reliable oldest, too old to be the adored youngest. My father was a contractor, the kind who built other people's dream kitchens and never got around to finishing his own. My mother taught second grade at Fairview Elementary for 31 years, and she was the kind of teacher who kept a drawer of granola bars for kids whose parents forgot to feed them breakfast. She was kind. I want to say that clearly because everything that happened later doesn't erase it. My mother was kind in the way that people can be kind to strangers and children and still, somehow, blind to their own family. The photo wall started small. A few frames from my parents' wedding, a photo of my father's parents on their farm in Ohio, a picture of my mother at 17 holding a trophy from a spelling bee she never stopped bringing up. By the time I was in elementary school, the wall had grown down half the hallway, and by the time I graduated high school, it ran the full length of the house, turning the corner into the kitchen. I used to stand in front of it as a kid and find myself, there, age 6, missing my front teeth, holding a fish I definitely did not catch myself. There, age 11, in a soccer uniform 2 sizes too big because my mother believed in growing into things. There, age 17, in a cap and gown, my father's arm around my shoulders, both of us squinting into the sun. Paul was on the wall too, though Les Paul left for college and functionally never really came back. He settled in Denver, became a claims adjuster, married a woman named Sherry who my mother has never quite warmed to, and visits twice a year, usually for the bare minimum required by decency. And then there was Denise. Denise is 5 years younger than me, which meant that by the time she was old enough to really register the family, I was already the built-in babysitter, the built-in explainer, The one who walked her to the bus stop and taught her to ride a bike because our parents were exhausted from raising 2 kids already and hadn't planned on a third. I didn't resent it, not then. I loved her. I still love her, which is part of what makes everything that came after so difficult to hold. Denise was easy to love in the specific way that made her easy to spoil. She was funny before she could talk in full sentences. She had a gift for making adults feel clever and important, which is its own kind of talent, and she deployed it constantly, instinctively, the way some kids are naturally good at sports. My mother used to say Denise could talk her way out of the electric chair, and she meant it as a compliment. By the time Denise was in middle school, a pattern had already set in that none of us named at the time, because you don't name water when you're the fish swimming in it. If Denise wanted something, a later curfew, a new phone, forgiveness for a bad report card, she got it eventually after a performance of remorse or charm calibrated exactly to what the moment required. If I wanted something, I was told to be reasonable, to think of the family budget, to remember that not everyone can have everything. I didn't experience this as injustice back then. I experienced it as the shape of the world. I was the responsible one. Denise was the charming one. Paul was the one who left. Those were our assigned roles, and I played mine well because I was good at being needed, and being needed felt for a long time close enough to being loved. Growing up on Larkspur Street, by the time I was 14 I had a system. I did my homework at the kitchen table before dinner, because if I waited until after, my mother would ask me to help clean up, and then it would be 9 o'clock and I'd still have algebra left. I babysat Denise on Friday nights so my parents could go to dinner with the Hendersons from church, and I never once got paid for it because family doesn't charge family, a rule that I would notice decades later seemed to apply only to me. Paul, 3 years older, had already begun the slow process of disappearing that would define his whole relationship with the family. He wasn't unkind. He was just absent, even when he was in the room, spending most of his high school years in his bedroom with headphones on, and most of his college years 2 states away, and most of his adult life another 2 states past that. When people ask me about my brother, I usually just say he checked out early and he's never really checked back in, which sounds harsh until you understand it's the kindest true thing I can say. Denise, meanwhile, was thriving in the particular ecosystem our house had built for her. She got a car for her 16th birthday. A used Honda Civic, but a car nonetheless. And I remember standing in the driveway while my parents handed her the keys, doing math in my head. I hadn't gotten a car. I'd gotten a bus pass and a promise that if I saved up enough from my job at the drugstore, they'd help me out with the rest. I saved $1,100 over 2 years. They contributed $400 more. I bought a 1994 Corolla with a cracked dashboard and drove it until the day I got married. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like a story about a golden child and a scapegoat, one of those tidy family psychology terms people throw around online. It wasn't that simple. My parents loved me. They came to my basketball games, even the away ones, even in bad weather. My father taught me to change a tire in the driveway one Saturday morning, patient in a way he rarely was about anything else, because he said a woman who could change her own tire would never have to depend on a man who might not deserve her. My mother wrote me letters when I moved away for college, real letters in her looping teacher's handwriting, that I still have in a shoebox in my closet. But there was also a ledger running underneath all of it, invisible, unspoken, and it always seemed to total in Denise's favor. I didn't understand yet that a ledger like that doesn't stay invisible forever. Eventually somebody writes it down. College and the first wedding. I went to state on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, because my parents told me plainly that they'd used most of what they could spare helping Paul with his tuition, and that I was the strong one who could figure it out. I did figure it out. I graduated with a degree in accounting and $11,000 in student loans, which I paid off myself over the following 9 years, a fact I mention now only because it becomes relevant much later, in a conversation at a kitchen table that I will never forget as long as I live. At 24, I married a man named Kevin Whitfield. I don't need to spend much time on Kevin because our marriage isn't really this story, except to say that it lasted 6 years, that we tried and failed to have children in the second half of it, and that Kevin's decision to leave in the end had less to do with me and more to do with a woman named Ashley from his gym, which is its own small, ordinary tragedy that doesn't need my commentary. What matters here is what happened to our wedding photo. For 19 years, a photograph of Kevin and me, laughing under a string of cafe lights at the reception, my mother's favorite photo of the 2 of us, hung on the wall on Larkspur Street. Third frame from the ceramic clock, next to a photo of Denise's junior prom. When Kevin and I divorced, my mother took the photo down without asking me, which at the time I appreciated. I didn't want to see Kevin's face every Thanksgiving. I assumed reasonably that she would eventually replace it with something else of mine. She never did. The space stayed empty for 2 years, and then quietly, without any conversation I was part of, a photo of Denise and her husband Craig at their anniversary dinner appeared there instead. I noticed it on a visit home in 2009 and said nothing. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things didn't matter for a long time because that was easier than doing the math. Tom. I met Tom Reyes at a continuing education seminar on nonprofit accounting, of all places, in 2011. He taught high school history at the time, and he'd come to the seminar because his school's booster club needed someone competent to look at their books, and he'd drawn the short straw. He was funny in a dry, unshowy way, and he asked me thoughtful questions instead of talking about himself, which I hadn't realized I'd been starving for until it happened. We married in 2013, in a small ceremony at a botanical garden neither of our families had to travel far to reach. My mother cried, genuinely, and told me it was the happiest she'd seen me look in a decade, which was true and which I appreciated more than she probably ever knew. My father walked me down the aisle and, in a rare unguarded moment, told me at the reception that Tom was the first one who ever looked at you like he knew what he had, which remains one of the kindest things my father has ever said to me. The wedding photo went up on the wall within a month. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest when I saw it there, like a held breath finally released. I thought that meant something had been repaired. I didn't yet understand that the wall wasn't a record of who mattered. It was a record of who was, at any given moment, convenient to display. Lily was born in 2014, and Jack in 2017. My mother came to the hospital both times with a casserole and a stack of hand-me-down onesies, and she cried holding each of them, and I believed, in those moments, that whatever old imbalance had existed between me and Denise had settled into something more equal. Now that we were both grown, both mothers, both simply daughters again instead of competitors for a limited resource we'd never agreed we were competing for. I was wrong about that. But it would take another 11 years, a spreadsheet, a laptop repair, and a phone call from a gallery in downtown Prescott for me to understand exactly how wrong. The roof. In September of 2015, my father called me at work, which he almost never did, because he considered phone calls during business hours an imposition. The roof's going, he said, without preamble. Estimate came in at $11,200. Insurance is only covering $3,200 of it because of the deductible. I did the math before he finished the sentence. $8,000, give or take. I can send you $8,000, I said. Tom and I had just refinanced our own mortgage and had a modest cushion in savings, the kind of cushion you build specifically so that when your father calls about a roof, you can say yes without flinching. Consider it a loan. Whenever you can. You're a lifesaver, Mary, he said, and I could hear real relief in his voice, the particular relief of a proud man who hates asking for help and is grateful not to have to ask twice. We'll get you back as soon as the Henderson job clears. I sent the money that week. I want to be precise about what happened next because precision is the thing I would come to rely on later, when precision was the only tool I had left that nobody could argue with. Over the following 4 years, my father mentioned repayment exactly twice, both times unprompted, both times followed by nothing. In 2016, he told me at Easter that he was still figuring out the best way to get me that roof money. In 2017, he mentioned it again at my birthday dinner, joking that he owed me one hell of an anniversary present. I laughed along both times. I did not bring it up myself. I had absorbed, somewhere in my childhood, the belief that a daughter who kept track of money owed to her by her own parents was a particular kind of ungrateful, a kind I did not want to become. The $8,000 was never repaid. I want to say that plainly without softening it because for years I softened it in my own head, telling myself it was fine, it was family, that money moves in circles over a lifetime and eventually it evens out. Did not even out. That was the thing I did not yet know. Denise's house. In March of 2016, Denise and Craig bought a house in the Ashford Heights development, a 4-bedroom colonial with a finished basement and a 2-car garage, priced at $340,000. I remember the day clearly because Denise called me sobbing with joy from the driveway, and I drove over that same afternoon with a bottle of champagne, genuinely thrilled for her. The way you can be genuinely thrilled for your sister even while some small quiet part of you is doing math you wish you weren't doing. I found out the down payment amount almost by accident 18 months later, when Denise mentioned at a family barbecue lightly the way you mentioned something you've stopped thinking of as remarkable, that Mom and Dad's $60,000 really saved us on the interest rate. $60,000. I remember exactly where I was standing by the cooler, a paper plate of potato salad balanced in one hand, and I remember the specific disorienting quality of hearing a number that large attached so casually to a sentence, as if it were a fact everyone already knew. A piece of family furniture nobody bothered mentioning because it had simply always been there. I hadn't known. Tom and I had bought our own house 2 years earlier, a modest 3-bedroom on Fenwick Court, with a down payment we had built entirely ourselves, dollar by dollar, over 4 years of not going on vacations and driving Tom's Honda until the transmission gave out. I had not asked my parents for help, partly out of pride, and partly I now understood, because some instinct in me already knew that asking would produce a different conversation than the one Denise had apparently had. I didn't say anything at the barbecue. I put down my paper plate, found Tom by the grill, and asked if we could leave a little early. In the car, he asked what was wrong, and I said nothing, I'm just tired, which was the first of many small lies I would tell myself and the people who loved me over the next several years, lies whose real purpose was to buy time until I understood what I was actually looking at. Dinner at the Ashfords. We went to Denise's new house for dinner a few weeks after the barbecue, a Sunday in late July, the kind of visit that had become a small family tradition, everyone gathering to admire whatever project Denise had finished most recently, since she'd already begun repainting rooms and rearranging furniture with the same instinctive flair that would eventually become her business. The house was, I'll admit, lovely. Denise had turned the dining room into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. A reclaimed wood table she'd found at a barn sale and refinished herself. Pendant lights she'd installed with a YouTube tutorial and a rented drill. My mother kept touching things as she walked through. The drapes, the mantel, a bowl of lemons on the kitchen island, with the particular reverence of a woman admiring something she felt she'd had a hand in creating. You have such an eye, Denise, my mother said, for perhaps the 4th time that evening, as we sat down to a pot roast Denise had clearly worked hard on. This house just feels like a home already. I want to be honest that I felt something small and unkind flicker in me that night, sitting at that beautiful reclaimed table in a house partly built on $60,000 I hadn't known existed, in my own 3-bedroom on Fenwick Court that Tom and I had furnished almost entirely from second-hand stores and a single trip to a discount outlet 2 towns over. I didn't say anything. I complimented the pot roast. I asked Craig about his new promotion at the insurance company. I helped clear plates after dinner the way I always did because clearing plates was a role I understood, a role that didn't require me to say anything true about what I was actually feeling. Driving home that night, Tom, who had picked up on something in my silence even without knowing the specific number yet, asked if the house had made me sad. I told him it hadn't, which was another one of those small lies, the kind that felt necessary at the time and that I would spend years eventually learning to stop telling, first to him and much later at a kitchen table in February of 2024 to everyone else as well. Conversation I didn't have. That October at my mother's 65th birthday dinner, I brought up carefully the idea of a small kitchen renovation Tom and I were considering, nothing extravagant, just new cabinets and a stove that worked reliably, a project we estimated at around $9,000. I mentioned gently that if there was any chance my parents could help the way they'd helped Denise, it would make a real difference. My mother's face did something I had seen before but never quite let myself name. A small tightening around the eyes, a recalibration, the look of someone doing arithmetic she didn't want to do out loud. Oh honey, she said, we're really stretched right now. The roof and your father's truck, and you know how tight things get on a fixed income. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You've always been so good at managing on your own though. That's one thing I've never worried about with you. I said of course I understand because that is what I had always said, and I let the subject drop, and I drove home that night with a knot in my stomach that I told myself was heartburn from the birthday cake. It would be almost 4 years before I understood that the sentence "you've always been so good at managing on your own" was not a compliment. It was a policy. It was the reason given quietly, consistently, for why help flowed one direction and not the other, and it had been deployed so smoothly for so long that I had mistaken it for a description of my character rather than a description of a decision my parents had made about me before I ever had the chance to prove I needed anything. Jack's fall. In June of 2018, when Jack was 1, he fell from our back porch steps and fractured his arm, A clean break that required a cast and, more urgently, a $500 emergency room copay we hadn't budgeted for that month. I called my mother that night, mostly for comfort, and mentioned the copay only in passing, the way you mention a minor stress alongside a major fright. She drove over the next morning with $200 in an envelope, which I want to note, honestly, because it matters to the shape of this story. My mother was not incapable of generosity. She showed up. She held Jack while I made phone calls to the pediatric orthopedist. She stayed the night so Tom and I could sleep in shifts. $200 was not $60,000, but it was something, and it was given with real love, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. What I noticed, though, because by then I had started noticing things, the way you start noticing a smell in a house once someone points it out to you, was the framing. My mother mentioned twice that week how proud she was that we could pull together $200 to help out. Language that treated the sum as a stretch, a sacrifice, evidence of family devotion. 6 weeks later, when Denise's car needed a new transmission, I overheard my father on the phone with her. I was in the kitchen refilling water glasses they didn't know I could hear, offering to just take care of it, a repair that, I found out later from an offhand comment at Christmas, ran to $2,200 paid in full. No mention of a loan, no envelope, no framing of sacrifice at all. It was simply done. The way you do something for a child you've never doubted deserves it. I didn't say anything. I refilled the water glasses and carried them back to the table and smiled through the rest of dinner. And in the car afterward, Tom asked me again if something was wrong, and I said again that I was just tired. The business. In January of 2019, Denise left her job at a real estate brokerage to start her own staging and interior design company, Callaway Home Collective. It was, by every outward measure, a reasonable and even admirable risk. Denise had a genuine eye for design, and her Instagram following had grown steadily for 2 years on the strength of it. What I didn't know, what none of us outside my parents knew for a long time, was that my father had co-signed a $40,000 small business loan to get her started, using the equity in the Larkspur Street house as collateral. I found this out by accident too, the way I found out most things in this story, because nobody in my family has ever been in the habit of simply telling me things directly. I overheard my father mention the business loan paperwork to my mother while I was helping him sort through his desk drawer looking for a spare house key, and when I asked casually what loan he meant, he changed the subject so quickly and so completely that I understood, even before I understood the specifics, that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. The business struggled for 2 years the way most small businesses do, bleeding money quietly before either succeeding or failing outright. I would not learn the full financial shape of what happened next until much later, in a conversation that took place in my father's garage in the fall of 2022, sitting on an overturned bucket while he pretended to organize a shelf of paint cans so he wouldn't have to look at me while he talked. The launch party. Denise held a launch party for Callaway Home Collective in February of 2019, at a rented event space downtown that had, ironically, once been a photography studio, all exposed brick and enormous factory windows that let in flat, even light. My parents rented 2 tables worth of catering, brought in a friend of my mother's from church who did calligraphy for the welcome sign, and invited close to 80 people, most of whom I didn't recognize. Denise's Instagram following had, by then, tipped over into something that resembled a small local following, the beginning of the modest but real influence that would eventually let her book paying design clients on the strength of her feet alone. I came with Tom, brought a gift, a set of vintage frames I'd found at an estate sale, thinking she could use them for client mood boards, and stood near the back near the cheese table for most of the evening, watching my sister work the room with the easy warmth she'd always had, the same gift for making people feel clever and important that had gotten her out of trouble as a child and was now, apparently, the entire engine of a business. My father gave a short toast that night, standing on a low step near the entrance, champagne glass raised, and he said, "This girl has always had more talent in her pinky than most people have in their whole body, and I am so proud to help her get this off the ground." The room applauded. Denise cried prettily the way she always cried, and hugged him in front of everyone. I want to be honest that I clapped too and meant it in the moment. I was proud of her genuinely, the specific pride of an older sister who remembers teaching a stubborn 7-year-old to ride a bike and still feels a private flicker of ownership over every subsequent success. What I didn't know that night, standing near the cheese table with a glass of Prosecco going warm in my hand, was the actual dollar figure behind the phrase "help her get this off the ground," that it wasn't encouragement or introductions or a few client referrals, but $40,000 of borrowed equity from a house that, on paper, belonged equally to all three of us someday. I found that number out 3 years later on a laptop I only meant to fix. The garage, fall 2022. I mentioned earlier that I eventually learned the full shape of the business loan in my father's garage, in the fall of 2022, and I want to describe that conversation now because it was the first time, though I did not yet know how to use what I learned, that my father came close to telling me the truth directly, rather than my having to assemble it from fragments. I'd driven over to help him move a table saw before the first frost, a task that had become, over the years, a periodic ritual between us, physical work side by side, that let my father talk more freely than he ever did face-to-face at the kitchen table. While we worked, he mentioned, almost offhand, that the loan for Denise's place had needed refinancing because the business was behind on payments. What loan? I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as I could manage, though something in my chest had already gone very still. The one that got her started, he said, not quite looking at me, running a rag along the saw's fence. 40,000. Business has had a rough couple years. You know how it is, restaurants and boutiques everywhere shutting down after the pandemic, people not spending on staging services the way they used to. We're just trying to keep her afloat until it turns around. That's a lot of money, Dad, I said carefully. It's an investment in her future, he said, a little defensively, and I recognized, even then, the specific tone he used when he sensed a conversation drifting somewhere he didn't want it to go: brisk, final, a door closing gently but firmly. Every family helps out where they can, Mary. You've never needed that kind of help, thank God. You've always landed on your feet. I let it go that day the way I'd let 100 similar comments go over the years. But I remember standing in that garage surrounded by sawdust and the smell of cut pine, doing a private, silent tally in my head. The roof loan, the down payment, the transmission, and now $40,000 I hadn't known about until that exact moment, and understanding, for the first time with real clarity, that these were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern. I just didn't yet have the paper to prove it. Thanksgiving 2019. I want to describe one Thanksgiving in detail because it's the kind of scene that, looking back, contained almost everything in miniature, and I didn't see it clearly until years later. We were at my parents' house, 14 people around a table meant for 10, leaves added in a way that made the tablecloth hang crooked. Denise's business was 6 months old and struggling, and she'd spent the appetizer course describing a client who'd backed out of a contract, her voice climbing toward tears by the pumpkin pie. My father, from the head of the table, said, "We'll figure something out, honey, don't you worry about the money side of it," and reached over to squeeze her hand, the exact same gesture my mother had used on me 3 years earlier at her own birthday, except aimed in the opposite direction, toward reassurance instead of deflection. Later that evening, washing dishes with my mother while the men watched football, I mentioned lightly that Tom and I were considering a family trip to the coast next summer, our first real vacation in 3 years, and wondered aloud whether it might be nice for the whole family to go together, parents included, split the cost of a rental house. My mother said, without looking up from the roasting pan, "Oh, we really can't swing that right now, sweetheart. Not with everything going on with Denise's business." I dried a serving bowl and said, "Of course, and I want you to understand that I said it and meant it because I did not yet have the full picture, the specific numbers, the receipts. I only had a feeling, low and persistent, like a stone in a shoe you keep meaning to shake out and never quite do. The wall begins to shift." I noticed the first real change to the photo wall in December of 2019, 3 weeks after that Thanksgiving. My mother had rearranged the frames. She did this periodically, a kind of seasonal curating she'd always done, swapping older photos out for newer ones to keep the wall current, a word she used often and which I would come to think about very differently in later years. That December, the photo of Lily's kindergarten graduation, which had hung for a year in a prominent spot near the hallway light switch, had been moved to a lower, dimmer corner near the linen closet. And in its place was a new photo of Denise's stepdaughter's dance recital. It was a small thing. I noticed it and told myself it was nothing, the ordinary churn of a busy household's wall, and I believed that for almost 2 more years, because believing it was easier than doing what I eventually had to do, which was count my mother's knee. In February of 2020, just before the pandemic changed everything, my mother had knee replacement surgery at a surgical center across town, not my own hospital, since she preferred her longtime orthopedist to any convenience of mine, and I took 4 days off work to help with her recovery, driving her to physical therapy, managing her medications, sleeping on the pull-out couch in case she needed help getting up in the night. I remember sitting with her insurance paperwork at her kitchen table a week after the surgery, helping her understand a bill for $1,800 that her supplemental insurance hadn't fully covered. "I don't know how we're going to manage this on top of everything," she said, worry creasing her forehead, and I told her without hesitation that Tom and I could cover it, that it wasn't a big deal, that she shouldn't stress about it during recovery. I paid the $1,800 the following week, quietly, the way I'd quietly paid for the roof 6 years earlier, and my mother thanked me with real visible relief, squeezing my hand at the kitchen table the exact same way she'd once squeezed it while declining to help with my kitchen renovation. I didn't think much of it at the time. Of course you help your mother recover from surgery. Of course you cover an unexpected bill when you're able to. What I didn't yet know, what I wouldn't discover until that spreadsheet 3 years later, was that this $1,800 too had been quietly logged in my father's private ledger as a loan, one of 11 separate entries under my name over those years, each one small enough on its own that I'd never thought to add them together, the way you don't notice a slow leak until the day you finally check the water bill and realize how much has actually gone missing. Grandma Eleanor. My grandmother, Eleanor Calloway, my father's mother, died in February of 2020, 3 weeks before the world shut down for the pandemic, which meant her funeral was one of the last normal gatherings any of us would have for over a year. She was 89, sharp until the last 6 months, and she had always been, in her quiet way, the one relative who saw the family clearly. I remember sitting with her in the hospital 2 days before she died, when she was lucid enough to talk but tired enough that she'd stopped bothering with the diplomacy she'd practiced her whole life. She held my hand and said, "You were always the one who did the actual work, Mary. Your mother knows it. She just doesn't know what to do about it." I didn't understand what she meant, not fully, not yet. I thought she was talking about babysitting Denise, about the bus stop, about all the small old debts of childhood. Grandma Eleanor left a modest estate. The house in Ohio, sold for $110,000, split 3 ways between my father and his 2 siblings, and a personal savings account of about $30,000 that she'd specified, in a handwritten note attached to her will, should be divided equally among all her grandchildren, 7 of us in total, which came to a little over $4,000 each. I received my $4,000 in June of 2020, wired directly from the estate's lawyer, clean and simple and exactly what my grandmother had asked for. I mention this only because it stands in such stark, deliberate contrast to what I would later learn about the inheritance that flowed through my own parents instead of around them, proof in its way, that when money passed through hands that weren't trying to manage a narrative, it landed exactly where it was supposed to. The group chat. The Calloway family group chat had existed since 2015, when my mother finally got a smartphone and Denise set it up for her, naming it, with typical Denise flourish, Calloway Crew Forever. I was in it. Paul was in it, though he rarely posted more than a thumbs-up emoji twice a year. My mother posted constantly. Recipes, church announcements, photos of her garden. In August of 2021, I noticed, scrolling back through old messages to find a recipe my mother had shared, that there was a second, smaller thread I hadn't known existed. A chat called Simply Family, containing my parents, Denise, and Craig, but not me and not Paul. I found it by accident, a notification that flashed briefly on my mother's phone screen while she was showing me a photo one evening at her kitchen table, before she swiped it away, too quickly, the way you swipe away something you didn't mean for anyone to see. I didn't say anything that night, but the knowledge sat in me for weeks, low and cold, and it was the thing, more than the roof money or the down payment or the transmission repair, that first made me start to wonder whether what I was looking at wasn't a series of small, disconnected oversights, but a shape, a structure, something built, whether or not anyone in it would have called it that out loud. My father's heart. In April of 2022, my father had a cardiac event at church, a blockage that required an emergency stent placement at Prescott Memorial, my own hospital, which meant I was the one who got the call from the ER charge nurse, a woman named Rebecca Cho who I'd worked with for 6 years and who broke protocol slightly to call me herself instead of making me wait for the switchboard. I drove to the hospital faster than I should have and sat with my mother in the surgical waiting room for 4 hours while they placed the stent. It was, without qualification, one of the most frightening days of my life, and I don't want the financial details of what came later to overshadow the plain, uncomplicated fear I felt sitting in that waiting room, holding my mother's hand while she cried. My father recovered well. But the event triggered something in both my parents, a sudden sharpened awareness of mortality, the kind that makes people start using words like estate planning and when we're gone at family dinners, usually followed by an uncomfortable silence and a change of subject. It was during his recovery, sitting in the hospital room on the third day, that I first heard my father mention to my mother, in a voice he clearly didn't realize carried, the words "the trust," followed by "we'll sort out the details with Denise later." I was refilling his water pitcher at the sink 3 feet away. He didn't know I'd heard him. I said nothing, filled the pitcher, and carried it back to his bedside table, and smiled, and asked if he wanted the TV on. That sentence, "we'll sort out the details with Denise later," would not fully make sense to me for another year and a half. But I never forgot it. I have always been good at not forgetting things, which is, I think now, both my greatest strength and the reason it took me as long as it did to act. Mia's wedding. My niece Mia, Paul's daughter, got married in September of 2022 in Denver, a small backyard ceremony that most of the family flew out for. Mia was 19, young for a wedding by any measure, and I remember pulling her aside at the reception, partly out of genuine affection. I'd always been closer to her than her own limited visits home would suggest, mostly through video calls and long emailed college application essays I'd helped her edit, and partly because I wanted selfishly one honest conversation with someone in this family who wasn't performing for anyone. "How's Grandma and Grandpa's whole thing with the money?" she asked me, apropos of nothing, while we stood by the dessert table. She was 19 and a little tipsy on her one allotted glass of champagne, and she had, I would learn, her father's gift for saying the true thing without registering its weight. "What money?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "The trust thing. For Aunt Denise's house. I heard Grandpa on the phone with a lawyer about it at Thanksgiving." She shrugged, already losing interest, scanning the yard for the cake table. "I figured you knew. You're always the one who knows stuff." I did not, in fact, know stuff. I smiled and told her congratulations again and asked about her honeymoon plans, and I did not sleep much that night, lying awake in a hotel room in Denver while Tom snored gently beside me, running through every half-heard sentence, every swiped-away phone screen, every casually mentioned number, trying to see the shape of something I still only half believed was there. The second mortgage. I learned about the second mortgage in November of 2022, 6 weeks after Mia's wedding, in the most ordinary way possible. My mother asked me, as her most financially literate child, to help her understand a letter from the bank that had arrived, she said, with a bunch of confusing numbers on it. The letter was a refinance confirmation. My parents had taken out a second mortgage on the Larkspur Street house, in August of that year, for $95,000. The stated purpose, in the loan documentation my mother handed me without apparently understanding what it revealed, was business capital investment, Callaway Home Collective. $95,000. On top of the $60,000 down payment for Denise's house, the $40,000 business loan co-signed against their own equity, the $2,200 for the transmission, the $200 framed as a stretch when it was my son with a broken arm. I sat at my parents' kitchen table with that letter in my hands, and I did the math quietly the way I do math at work without my face changing. My mother was watching me, waiting for me to explain the confusing part, and I looked up at her and said, "It's just a refinance, Mom. Looks straightforward." Which was true. It was straightforward. That was the problem. I did not confront her that day. I want to be honest about why I was afraid. Not of my mother exactly, but of what it would mean to say the true thing out loud, to become the daughter who counted, the daughter who kept a ledger, the daughter my whole family had quietly agreed, without ever discussing it, that I was not allowed to become. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my car in my own driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And when Tom asked for the 100th time in 7 years if something was wrong, I finally said, "Yes, I think something's very wrong. I just don't know what to do about it yet." It was the first time I told him the truth instead of "I'm just tired," and something in his face changed when I said it. Relief, I think, that I'd finally handed him the weight I'd been carrying alone, and worry in equal measure for what came next. A reminder. Before we go further, I want to pause and thank everyone who's been commenting and sharing these stories. It genuinely means more than you know. And if you haven't yet, hitting subscribe helps far more people find their way to stories like this one. Now back to Larkspur Street, because what I found 6 months later, in a laptop I only ever meant to fix, would change everything I understood about the family I'd spent 40 years believing I knew. Christmas 2022. Christmas that year was the first time I let myself really look at the wall instead of just walking past it. I stood in the hallway on Christmas morning while Jack and Lily unwrapped presents in the next room, and I counted. I actually counted frame by frame the way I'd count line items in an audit. 41 photographs, floor to ceiling around the corner into the kitchen. Of those 41, 6 featured me in some form, 3 from my childhood, 2 group shots from Christmases past that I happened to be standing in, and 1 still of my wedding to Tom, tucked now in the lower row near the linen closet, in a spot it had not occupied a year earlier. Denise appeared in 19. Her stepdaughter in 11 more. I didn't say anything. I went back into the living room and watched Jack open a remote control car and Lily open a set of watercolor pencils, and I smiled, and I ate the cinnamon rolls my mother makes every Christmas morning, the recipe she's made since before I was born, and I told myself one more time that it didn't matter, that photo walls are not scoreboards, that love isn't a pie chart. But I had counted. And once you've counted something, you can't uncount it. That's the thing about numbers, they don't care how you feel about them. They just sit there being true, waiting for you to be ready to look at them. The question I finally asked. In March of 2023, at my father's request, I drove over to help him understand a Medicare supplement form, one of the small, ordinary tasks that had become, over the years, part of my unofficial job description in the family, the daughter who understood paperwork. We sat at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd once asked for help with a kitchen renovation and been gently, kindly refused. While we worked through the form, I said as casually as I could manage, "Hey Dad, whatever happened with that roof loan from a few years back?" No rush, obviously. Just curious where that landed. My father didn't look up from the form. "Oh, that," he said. "Yeah, we've been meaning to sort that out. Things have just been tight, with everything going on with your sister's business." "Sure," I said. "No worries." But I noticed that day something I hadn't let myself notice before. The phrase "everything going on with your sister's business" had become, over 8 years, the answer to every question I asked about money in this family. It had explained the missing kitchen renovation. It had explained the missing vacation. It had explained, apparently, an $8,000 loan that had simply evaporated into the family's understanding of itself, the way water evaporates on a hot day, present one moment and then, without anyone quite noticing the transition, simply gone. I finished the Medicare form, kissed my father on the cheek, and drove home. And that was the last time I asked a direct question about money in that house before I found the spreadsheet that answered every question I hadn't yet had the courage to ask. Uncle Frank. My father's brother, Frank Calloway, is 74, a retired machinist, blunt in the specific way that men of his generation mistake for honesty and sometimes actually is. He and my father have never been especially close. A decades-old disagreement about their own mother's care in her final years left a residue neither of them ever fully cleared. But Frank comes to the big holidays, sits in the same chair every time, and says the things nobody else in the family will say out loud. At Easter in 2023, 4 months before I found the laptop, Frank cornered me by the coffee maker while everyone else was in the living room watching Denise's stepdaughter perform a dance recital routine on the good rug. "You still driving that same Corolla?" he asked apropos of nothing, though I understood even then that Frank rarely asked anything apropos of nothing. "Traded it in years ago, Uncle Frank. I've got a Subaru now." "Huh." He poured his coffee black, the way he'd taken it since before I was born. "Your sister's got that new Lexus sitting in the driveway. 3rd car in 4 years. He looked at me sideways over the rim of his mug and said, "You ever notice how your dad talks about you two different? He says Denise needs a hand. He says you're so capable." Same sentence structure, but one of those is a compliment and one of those is a way of saying no. I laughed it off that day, told him he was reading too much into things, the way you do when someone hands you a piece of the truth before you're ready to hold it. But I thought about that conversation constantly in the months that followed, especially after the laptop, especially at the kitchen table in February, because Frank had seen the shape of it years before I'd let myself see it, simply by paying the kind of attention nobody else in the family seemed willing to pay. When I finally told Frank in March of 2024, a condensed version of what I'd found and what I'd said at the kitchen table, he nodded slowly, unsurprised, and said only, "About time somebody said it out loud. I've watched your dad do this dance with money since your grandmother was alive. Some people just can't stand to look straight at what they're doing, so they build a system so complicated even they get lost in it. It was, I think, the single most useful thing anyone in my extended family said to me during the entire ordeal, precisely because it came without sentiment, without softening, just a plain, weathered observation from a man who had spent 74 years watching his own family avoid its own reflection. Aunt Carol. My mother's sister Carol is the family's designated peacemaker. The one who calls everyone individually before a holiday to make sure nobody's feelings got hurt at the last one. The one who brings a card and a small gift for every occasion, remembered and logged in a spiral notebook she's kept since 1994. Carol loved me and Denise with what always felt like scrupulous, deliberate equality. I never once, growing up, felt that Carol favored one of us over the other, which made her reaction when I finally told her what I'd found all the more unsettling. "Oh, Mary," she said on the phone in March of 2024. Her voice gentle but strained, "I don't think your parents meant anything by it. You know how your mother is, she just goes where the need is loudest, and Denise has always been loud about her needs, and you've never been loud about anything in your whole life." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. You've never been loud about anything in your whole life. It was true, and it was said with love, and it also, I realized slowly, described the precise mechanism by which an entire family could look directly at an injustice and explain it away as a simple accounting of volume rather than value, as if love were a resource that only responded to the loudest request, rather than something a parent might be expected to notice and offer without ever being asked. I told Carol as kindly as I could that I understood what she meant, but that a child shouldn't have to learn to be loud in order to be seen, and that some of us had been taught, very early and very thoroughly, that quiet was the price of being loved at all. She was quiet on the phone for a moment and then she said, "I don't think I ever thought about it that way," which was, in its own small way, exactly the kind of honest reckoning I had hoped this whole ordeal might eventually produce in the people around me, even the ones who hadn't caused it directly. A call to Denver. I called my brother Paul in April of 2024, 2 months after the kitchen table conversation, mostly out of a sense of obligation. He deserved to know what I'd found, given that his own share of the inheritance was tangled up in the same estate note, even if his own distance from the family meant he'd never fully registered the imbalance the way I had. Paul listened to the whole story without much visible reaction, which did not surprise me. Paul has always processed things at a slower, more private pace than the rest of us, retreating into himself the way he'd retreated from the family altogether decades earlier. When I finished, he said, "Honestly, Mary, I checked out of that house so early I never really noticed who was getting what. I just knew I didn't want to be in the room for any of it." He paused. "I'm sorry you had to be the one who stayed close enough to see it clearly. That was never fair to you either. The family needing someone to keep watching, keep managing, keep noticing while I just got to leave." It was, in its own understated way, an apology I hadn't realized I needed, not for the money, which barely concerned Paul at all, but for the unspoken family assignment that had put me permanently on duty while he'd simply walked off the job. We talked for almost an hour that day, longer than we'd talked in years, and while Paul remains distant to this day, prone to letting months pass without a call, I understood, after that conversation, that his absence was its own long-running response to the same family, not evidence that he'd escaped its patterns any more successfully than I had. Craig sighed. Denise's husband, Craig, is an insurance underwriter, careful with numbers in his own professional life in a way that made his blindness to our family's numbers, for so many years, a genuine puzzle to me until he explained it himself, over a beer on his back patio in May of 2024, 3 months after the kitchen table. "I want you to know I never saw the full spreadsheet," he said. "I knew about the down payment. Knew about the business loan, obviously, since I helped Denise with the paperwork. I didn't know about the second mortgage until your dad brought it up that Sunday. And I sure as hell didn't know it was labeled different than what you got." He turned his beer bottle slowly on the patio table, not quite meeting my eyes. I think Denise didn't fully let herself add it all up either, honestly. It's easier to receive help than to audit it, especially when receiving it feels like being loved. I appreciated Craig's honesty more than I expected to. He was under no obligation to defend anything to me, and yet he didn't try to minimize what had happened either. He simply told me the truth of his own limited vantage point, which was, by then, exactly the kind of plain honesty I'd come to value over any performance of loyalty in either direction. "For what it's worth," he added, "Denise has been different since that Sunday. Quieter. I think she's doing some of the same math you did, just 8 years behind schedule. The laptop. In July of 2023, my father's laptop stopped turning on, An 8-year-old Dell he used mostly for solitaire and emailing his brother Frank, but which also I would discover, held the entirety of his financial life, backed up in a folder he'd never bothered to password protect because he didn't fully understand that a password could be applied to a folder rather than just the computer itself. He brought it to me on a Saturday apologetic, asking if I could take a look before we spend money on the Geek Squad. I said of course, and I set it up on my kitchen table that evening while Tom took the kids to a movie, planning to spend maybe 20 minutes running a diagnostic before giving up and telling him to just buy a new one. The laptop turned on fine as it turned out. A loose battery connection, nothing more. But before I closed it, I did what I always do with any computer that crosses my desk, professional habit more than anything else. I checked the desktop for clutter, meaning to tidy a few icons into folders the way I do for my mother's computer every few months. There was a folder on the desktop labeled Simply Family Finances Working. I want to be honest about what happened next because I think it matters to understanding who I am and how I handled everything that followed. I did not open it immediately. I sat there for almost a full minute with my hand on the trackpad, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as a held breath. Aware that I was standing at a door I could still choose not to walk through. I opened it. What the spreadsheet said. The folder contained 11 files. Bank statements, scanned copies of loan documents, a PDF of the trust paperwork my father had mentioned, without knowing I'd heard him, in his hospital room a year earlier, and one Excel spreadsheet, titled Gift Tracking, last modified 9 days before he brought me the laptop. I opened it at my kitchen table alone at 9:40 at night, and I read it 3 times before I let myself believe what it said. It was a running ledger going back to 2015 tracking every significant financial gift my parents had given to each of their 3 children. My father, it turned out, was more methodical than I had ever given him credit for. The same instinct that made him a good contractor, the habit of measuring twice, had apparently extended to keeping careful, private track of exactly how unevenly he and my mother had distributed their money among their children, for reasons the spreadsheet itself never explained but which the numbers made undeniable. The total for Paul, over 8 years, $14,000, mostly small amounts around his own children's births and a single $4,000 contribution toward Mia's wedding. The total for me, $8,200, the roof loan plus the $200 for Jack's cast, every dollar of it labeled in my father's own handwriting turn-typing as loan with a small note beside the roof entry that read simply outstanding. The total for Denise, $211,000. The $60,000 down payment. The $40,000 business loan. The $95,000 second mortgage, routed, the spreadsheet clarified, entirely into Denise's company rather than any home improvement, contrary to what the bank paperwork had implied. The transmission repair. A dozen smaller entries I hadn't known about at all. $600 here, $1,200 there. A wedding anniversary gift of $4,000 in 2021 that I had never heard mentioned once. Every single entry for Denise was labeled, without exception, gift. Not loan. Gift. I sat at my kitchen table with my father's laptop open in front of me, and I felt, for the first time in this entire story, something other than sadness. I felt a very calm, very cold kind of clarity, the specific feeling I get at work when a discrepancy finally resolves itself into an explanation, except this discrepancy was my own life, and the explanation was that my parents had, for 8 years, quietly and deliberately funded one daughter's entire adult existence while keeping a private ledger insisting that the other daughter's occasional help was debt. There was one more file in the folder. A Word document titled Estate Notes, dated 4 months earlier, in April. I opened it last and it was the shortest document, only half a page, but it was the one that finally made me close the laptop and sit very still in my kitchen for a long time before I could make myself move again. It read in my father's plain, unpolished prose, "Given everything we've already put into Dee's house and business, feels fair that the Larkspur house should transfer to her when we're gone, with M&P getting cash equivalent from savings investments to balance it out. Talk to lawyer about how to word this so it doesn't look like we're playing favorites. Maybe frame it as Dee taking care of the house because she's local. Mary's smart. She'll understand the numbers even if she doesn't love them. Mary's smart. She'll understand the numbers even if she doesn't love them." He wasn't wrong. I did understand the numbers. I understood them completely, sitting alone at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, and understanding them changed absolutely nothing about how much they hurt. The decision. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my back porch until almost 2 in the morning, the laptop closed on the table beside me, listening to the neighborhood go quiet, and I thought about 100 small moments from the previous 8 years reorganizing themselves into a pattern I could finally see whole. Tom found me there when he woke at 5 for his run. He sat down without a word, the way he does when he can tell a conversation needs room before it needs words, and eventually I told him everything, the spreadsheet, the loan labeled outstanding, the estate note, all of it. He didn't say much while I talked. When I finished, he reached over and took my hand and said, "You don't have to decide what to do about this tonight. But you do have to decide eventually whether you're going to keep pretending you don't see it. I don't think you can unsee it now." He was right. That was the hardest part of that first week. Not the anger, which came and went in waves, but the low, constant hum of a decision I knew I eventually had to make and didn't yet know how to make well. I called my best friend, Nora Fitch, a trauma nurse I'd known since our 20s, 2 days later, and told her everything over coffee at a diner neither of us usually went to, chosen specifically because it was far enough from both our normal lives that I could fall apart a little without an audience. Nora listened for a long time without interrupting, and then she said the thing I needed someone outside my own head to say. "This isn't really about the money, Mary. You could afford to lose $8,000. What you can't afford is another decade of pretending you don't know what you know. That'll cost you more than any amount of money ever could." I saw my therapist, Dr. Patricia Lowe, the following week, someone I'd been seeing on and off since Kevin and I divorced, mostly for the ordinary maintenance of a busy life rather than any crisis. I told her about the laptop and she asked me a question that stayed with me for months afterward. "What are you actually afraid of if you bring this into the light?" I thought about it honestly out loud for the first time. That they'll say I'm being petty. That they'll say money isn't love and I'll sound like I think it is. That Denise will cry and everyone will comfort her, the way they always have, and somehow I'll end up apologizing for bringing it up at all. And if that happens, Dr. Lowe said, will it change what's true? It wouldn't. That was the thing I finally understood, sitting in her office that October afternoon. The numbers were true regardless of how anyone reacted to them. My job was not to manage everyone else's feelings about the truth. My job was simply to decide what to do with it. I met with a financial advisor, Sandra Voss, whom I'd worked with professionally for years through the hospital's retirement program, and asked her, hypothetically at first, what options existed for someone in my situation. An unequal family gifting pattern, a looming inheritance question, a parent's estate plan that hadn't yet been finalized. She was blunt in the way I needed. "You have more power here than you think," she said. "The house isn't transferred yet. Nothing's final. The only real question is whether you want to try to influence the outcome, or just document the truth and let the chips fall." And I consulted a lawyer, David Kim, a calm, precise man recommended by a colleague at the hospital, who specialized in estate and elder family matters. I brought him copies of everything, the spreadsheet, the loan documents, the mortgage refinance letter, screenshots of the group chat I'd found by accident, photographs of the wall itself, taken discreetly on my phone at Christmas. He looked through it all slowly, methodically, the way I imagine I look at a hospital's books when something doesn't add up, and at the end he said, "Legally, your parents can distribute their assets however they want while they're alive, and mostly however they want after they're gone, within certain limits around undue influence and capacity. This isn't really a legal problem yet. It's a family problem with legal edges. My advice is to document everything, understand your options, and decide what outcome you actually want, repair, fairness, distance, or all three, before you say a single word to anyone in your family." I left his office with a folder of notes and a question I turned over for the next 3 months. What did I actually want? Not revenge, I never wanted that, and I want to be honest that the thought never seriously tempted me. Not because I'm a saint, but because I understood, even in my angriest moments, that revenge would only give my family a new story to tell about me, one where I was the problem, the daughter who blew up Thanksgiving over money. What I wanted, I eventually decided, sitting with Tom on our back porch on a cool evening in late October, was simpler and harder than revenge. I wanted the truth acknowledged. I wanted to stop being quietly, politely erased from a story everyone else got to keep writing. And I wanted my children to grow up understanding that love and fairness weren't supposed to be different things, distributed by different rules to different children forever. Rebecca in the break room. I want to pause here and tell you a little more about Rebecca Cho, because she reappears at a few points in this story, and I don't want her to feel like a name that only exists to move a plot forward. Rebecca is 39, an ER charge nurse who has worked at Prescott Memorial for 11 years, sharp-tongued in exactly the way you want the person managing a chaotic emergency room to be, and one of the very few people at work who knew by that autumn of 2023 most of what I was carrying. We'd become close over the years the way people do in a hospital, a shared understanding of certain kinds of exhaustion, the particular gallows humor that gets you through a bad shift, the mutual respect of two women who both in different departments spent their days making sure things added up correctly when other people's attention was elsewhere. Rebecca had her own complicated family history. A younger brother their parents had bailed out of debt 3 separate times while quietly declining to help Rebecca with nursing school, a fact she'd mentioned to me once, years earlier, over a bad vending machine coffee in the same flat, unbothered tone she used to announce a trauma coming in. In the break room one evening in October of 2023, restocking the coffee station between patients, she asked how things were going and I told her briefly about the laptop. She didn't look surprised. Every family's got a version of this, she said, tearing open a coffee filter. Mine gave my brother 11 grand for a truck he wrecked 8 months later, and told me a 4-year nursing degree was an investment I should be handling myself since I was always so mature about money. She said it lightly, the way you learn to say things that used to break you but no longer do, at least not the same way. You want my honest opinion? Say it once clearly, and then let the silence do some of the work. Don't fill every silence trying to make them feel better about what you just said. That's the mistake I made for about a decade before I finally stopped. It was Rebecca's advice, given in a break room over bad coffee between two patients, that I would carry into the kitchen table conversation itself 4 months later, word for word, because it was the truest, most useful thing anyone told me during the entire ordeal, not from a lawyer or a therapist, though both of them helped in their own ways, but from a coworker who had already walked a version of this same road and knew exactly which stretch of it was hardest. Building the file. I spent the next 4 months building what David Kim, only half joking, started calling the Mary file. I am, by profession and by temperament, exactly the right person for this particular job, and I want to describe the process in some detail, because I think the care I put into it mattered as much as anything I eventually said out loud. I requested copies of the roof loan text messages from 2015 through my phone carrier's archive system, since I'd since upgraded phones twice and lost the originals. I found 6 years of tax return summaries showing exactly what Tom and I had and hadn't received in gifts, which our accountant, a methodical woman named Carla, helped me pull together in an afternoon. I obtained, through a public records request that took 3 weeks and a small fee, the recorded mortgage documents on the Larkspur Street house, showing the second mortgage in black and white, with my parents' signatures on it. I saved screenshots of the hidden family group chat, careful, this time to note timestamps. I photographed the wall itself twice more, in November and again in January, documenting the continued shift. By January of 2024, the count stood at 44 photographs total, 5 featuring me, 22 featuring Denise's household. I did not do any of this to build a case for a courtroom. David was clear, and I agreed with him, that this was never going to be a legal fight. My parents were entitled to give their money to whomever they wished while they were alive, and nothing I'd found constituted fraud or coercion in any legal sense. I built the file because I needed, for my own peace of mind, to know that when I finally spoke, I would speak from certainty rather than accusation, from documented fact rather than years of accumulated hurt feelings that could be waved away as oversensitivity. I also, during those months, made quieter, more personal preparations. Tom and I met with our own financial advisor and adjusted our will and our children's guardianship documents, a task we'd been putting off for years, prompted now by an unwelcome but clarifying awareness of how quickly a family's understanding of itself could shift underneath you. We are careful now that our own 2 children will never have to reconstruct, decades from now, an unequal history from a spreadsheet neither of them was ever supposed to find. I stopped, quietly, offering unpaid financial help to my parents. When my father mentioned in December that his truck needed brakes, I said, "That sounds stressful. Have you looked into what a mechanic would charge?" Instead of reaching for my checkbook, a small shift that felt at the time enormous, and that neither of my parents seemed to notice at all, which told me something too. I talked to Rebecca Cho at the hospital, not about the family situation specifically, but about how she'd navigated her own complicated relationship with an unfavored sibling, and she gave me a piece of advice I carried into the confrontation itself. Say the true thing once, clearly, and then let the silence do some of the work. Don't fill every silence trying to make them feel better about what you just said. I decided after much thought on the setting and the timing. Not Thanksgiving, too loaded, too many witnesses who hadn't asked to be part of this, too likely to become a story about me ruining the holiday, rather than a story about what had actually happened. I chose instead a quiet Sunday afternoon in February of 2024, my parents' kitchen table, the same table where I'd once asked for kitchen renovation help and been refused, the same table where I'd once helped my father with a Medicare form and asked gently about a roof loan he brushed aside. I asked Denise to be there too. Not to ambush her, but because I understood by then that whatever came next needed to include her directly, honestly, rather than happening around her in whispers the way so much of this story already had. I told them I wanted to talk about some things I'd found while helping Dad with his laptop. I gave them 3 days' notice. I wanted them to come to that table prepared to have an adult conversation, and I wanted honestly to give myself 3 more days to make sure I was doing this from clarity rather than anger, because I understood by then that the entire power of what I had to say depended on saying it calmly once and meaning every word. The kitchen table. I arrived at Larkspur Street at 2 o'clock on a gray, cold Sunday in February, a folder under my arm, my heart steady in a way that surprised me. Tom stayed home with the kids. This was not, I had decided, a conversation that needed an audience of any kind, not even a supportive one. My mother had made coffee. My father sat at the head of the table, the same seat he'd occupied at every Thanksgiving I'd ever described in this story. Denise arrived 12 minutes late, Craig waiting in the car outside, and she came in already faintly defensive, the posture of someone who'd sensed correctly that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be comfortable. Okay, she said, sitting down, not quite meeting my eyes. What's going on? You've got Mom all worried. I opened my folder. I had practiced in the car, not raising my voice, not leading with accusation, and I want to tell you honestly that it took everything I had to keep my hands steady as I laid the first document on the table. I fixed Dad's laptop back in July, I said. While I was in there, I found a spreadsheet. I want to talk about what was in it. My father went very still. My mother's hand moved to her coffee cup and stayed there, not drinking, just holding. I found out that in 2015 I loaned you $8,000 for the roof, I said, looking at my father, keeping my voice level. It's still marked outstanding in your own spreadsheet. I never asked for it back because I didn't want to be the daughter who counted. But I want you to know that I counted. I've always counted. I just didn't say anything. Mary, my mother started. I'm not finished, I said, gently but clearly, and she stopped. In that same spreadsheet, over the same 8 years, Denise received $211,000. Every entry for me is labeled loan. Every entry for her is labeled gift. I have copies of the mortgage documents. I have the group chat you two started without me and Paul in it. I have photos of the wall in the hallway from 4 different years, showing exactly how many times my family has been quietly moved out of it while Denise's family was moved in. Denise's face had gone pale and then blotchy, the way it always did right before she cried. A pattern I'd watched since she was 7 years old. This isn't fair, she said, her voice already thick. You're making it sound like I asked for all that. I didn't ask Dad to co-sign anything. I know you didn't sit down and demand $211,000 in one meeting, I said, and I meant it. This was the part one had rehearsed most carefully, because I did not want this conversation to become a war between sisters when the real decisions had been made by 2 other people at this table. I'm not angry at you for being loved generously, Denise. I'm asking Mom and Dad why generosity toward you always came labeled as a gift, and help toward me always came labeled as a debt I somehow never got to collect on. My father finally spoke, his voice rough. It wasn't ever meant like that, Mary. Denise needed more help. You've always been able to handle things on your own. I handled things on my own, I said, because I was raised to believe that asking for help made me a burden, while Denise was raised to believe that asking for help was simply how love worked in this family. Those are 2 different childhoods, Dad, even though we grew up in the same house. The room was quiet for a long moment. My mother was crying now, quietly, into a folded napkin, and I felt the old deep pull to comfort her, to soften what I'd said, to apologize for the discomfort I'd caused rather than the truth I'd stated. I let the silence sit instead, the way Rebecca had told me to, and it was one of the hardest things I have ever made myself do. There's one more thing, I said finally, and I laid the last page on the table, the printout of the estate note, my father's own words. I found this too. About the house going to Denise, And Paul and me getting cash to balance it out. And the part about wording it carefully so it doesn't look like you're playing favorites. My father put his head in his hands. My mother said through the napkin, we were going to talk to you about all of it eventually, Mary. We just didn't know how. I believe that, I said, and I did. I don't think my parents ever sat down and planned to hurt me. I think they made 1,000 small, comfortable decisions over 8 years, each one easier than the last, until the decisions added up to something none of them had consciously chosen but all of them had, in the end, allowed. But I'm not here today to ask you to give me $200,000, or to punish Denise for something she mostly didn't control. I'm here to say this, and I only need to say it once. I am done being the daughter this family quietly agreed didn't need anything. From today on, if you want a relationship with me, it has to be an honest one. That means no more hidden spreadsheets. No more group chats I'm not in. No more explaining my own erasure from a photo wall as some kind of accident. If something is unequal, I want it said out loud so at least I can choose with my eyes open whether I want to keep showing up for it. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. Then my father lifted his head and said, quietly, in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use before. Not defensive, not deflecting, just tired and honest, you're right. I don't have anything else to say except that you're right, and I'm sorry, and I don't know how to fix 8 years in one afternoon. You don't have to fix it in one afternoon, I said. You just have to stop pretending it isn't real. Denise had been quiet through most of my father's response, twisting a napkin in her lap, and now she looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. I don't know what you want me to say, Mary. I didn't ask for any of this to be unfair. I didn't sit down and decide I deserved more than you. I know that, I said again, and I meant it as gently as I could manage while still being entirely honest. But I need you to hear this part too. You've known on some level for years that things were different for you. The car at 16. The house down payment you casually mentioned at a barbecue like it was nothing. You didn't build the system, Denise. But you've lived inside it comfortably for a long time without ever once asking why it worked the way it did. She flinched at that, visibly, and for a moment I thought she might get up and leave right then. Instead she said very quietly, I think some part of me always knew asking would ruin it. If I asked why I got more, I'd have to actually look at it. It was easier to just say thank you and not look too close. It was, I would come to realize months later, the most honest sentence my sister said that entire afternoon, and possibly the first fully honest sentence she'd said to me in a decade. I want you to remember that line because it's the one I'll come back to at the end of this story, and it's the truest thing I said that whole afternoon. You don't have to fix it in one afternoon. You just have to stop pretending it isn't real. Denise left before I did. Craig's car pulling out of the driveway too fast, gravel spitting under the tires. My mother hugged me at the door still crying and said she loved me, and I told her I loved her too because it was true, and because loving someone and being furious with them I had learned were not actually opposites. I drove home in the gray February light with my empty folder on the passenger seat, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt mostly exhausted and light in the specific way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight at all. The months after. Denise did not speak to me for 11 weeks after that Sunday. She unfollowed me on Instagram, which I noticed but never mentioned, and she skipped Jack's 12th birthday party in March, sending a gift card by mail instead with no note attached. I felt that absence. I want to be honest that it hurt, that some old loyal part of me still wanted my little sister to simply understand, without my having to make her, why the truth had needed saying. My mother called me every week during those months, sometimes just to talk about ordinary things, her garden, a book she was reading, and I let her because I understood by then that she was trying in her own halting way to build back towards something honest, one ordinary phone call at a time. In April, she told me, unprompted, that she and my father had gone back to their lawyer and revised the estate note, not to give me the house, which I had never asked for and genuinely did not want, tangled as it was in 8 years of complicated feeling, but to have the eventual value of Larkspur Street divided equally among all three of us, with Denise given the option to buy out her siblings' shares if she wanted to keep it, at a fair appraised price. It's not going to undo the last 8 years, my mother said on the phone that day, her voice small. I know that. I just wanted you to know we did it. Thank you for telling me, I said, and I meant it, though I also understood that a revised legal document, however welcome, was not the same thing as the years already spent, the vacations not taken, the kitchen never renovated, the quiet, corrosive belief I'd carried for a decade that my needs were somehow less legitimate than my sister's. My father and I had a harder time finding our way back. Men of his generation, I've come to understand, often mistake silence for repair. He'd send me articles about home maintenance, or ask about Jack's baseball season, gestures of ordinary affection that never once circled back to an actual acknowledgement of the roof loan, the estate note, any of it. In June, for months after the kitchen table conversation, I finally called him directly and said, "Dad, I need you to say the actual words. Not fix the will. The words." There was a long pause on the line, and then he said quietly, "I'm sorry I let you believe all those years that you mattered less. You never did. I just made it easier on myself to act like you did." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the speech a movie would have written for him. But it was the first time in my adult life my father had ever apologized to me directly, without qualification, and I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot and cried for the first time since finding the spreadsheet. Denise and I finally spoke in late April, at Lily's 10th birthday party, of all places, standing near the drink cooler in my backyard while our children ran through a sprinkler. She looked tired, older than her 38 years, and she said without preamble, "I've been so mad at you for months, and I think I finally figured out it's not actually you I'm mad at." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I think some part of me always knew, Mary. I just never had to look at it as long as nobody said it out loud. And once you said it out loud, I had to figure out what it meant that I let it happen too. That I never once asked why you weren't getting what I was getting." I told her I wasn't asking her to feel guilty for the rest of her life. I told her I mostly just wanted going forward an honest relationship, one where we could talk about hard things directly instead of finding them out by accident 9 years too late, in a folder on a broken laptop. She hugged me by the cooler, and it wasn't a full repair, not yet, but it was a real start, the kind you can only build one honest conversation at a time. Nora after. I met Nora at our usual diner again in April, the same booth where I'd first told her about the spreadsheet the previous summer. She listened to the whole aftermath, the 11 weeks of silence from Denise, my father's halting apology, the revised estate note, and then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same gesture my mother had used so many times over the years, except this time it didn't carry any hidden asterisk. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Nora said. "You didn't do this to get anything back. You did it because you couldn't keep living inside a lie you'd already seen the seams of. That's not really about money at all in the end. That's about self-respect." She stirred her coffee, thoughtful. "Most people never get there. They see the seams and just keep pretending the fabric's whole, because looking at the tear feels scarier than living with the cold. You didn't do that. That's the whole story, honestly, more than any spreadsheet. I've thought about that description often since. A family as a piece of fabric worn thin in specific places by years of careful avoidance, and the particular courage it takes to finally point at the tear instead of arranging your life around it forever." Dr. Lowe afterward. I saw Dr. Patricia Lowe again in March of 2024, a few weeks after the kitchen table, mostly to process what had happened rather than to figure out what to do next. I told her about my father's stillness, my mother's tears into the folded napkin, Denise's blotchy face, and her admission by the drink cooler weeks later that some part of her had always known. "How do you feel saying it all out loud to me now, compared to how you thought you'd feel back in October?" she asked. I sat with the question for a while before answering. "Lighter," I said finally. "Not happy exactly. Nothing's resolved the way I used to imagine resolution would feel, back when I still thought there'd be some clean moment where everyone apologized and everything went back to normal. It's messier than that. But it's honest, and honest is quieter than I expected. I thought speaking the truth would feel loud. It mostly just feels calm. That's usually how it goes," she said. "The anticipation of a hard conversation is almost always louder than the conversation itself. People spend years being afraid of a single afternoon." She made a note, then added gently, "You did something difficult correctly, Meredith. Not perfectly, there's no such thing as perfectly in a situation like this, but correctly. You told the truth without needing anyone else's permission to believe it, and you did it without becoming the version of yourself you were afraid of becoming. That's worth acknowledging. Even if the ending isn't tidy. I've carried that session with me since, more than almost any other single conversation from that entire period. The reminder that peace, real peace, is quieter and less triumphant than the version we imagine when we're still afraid to speak. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles slowly, the way a held breath finally fully releases. Mia calls. My niece Mia called me in May of 2024, 3 months after the kitchen table, from her dorm room at the community college she'd enrolled in after her wedding, sounding younger on the phone than I'd heard her sound since she was a teenager. My dad told me a little of what happened, she said. I feel weird about it. I'm the one who kind of tipped you off at my wedding, remember? About the trust thing? You didn't do anything wrong, Mia, I told her. You just said a true thing you didn't know was a secret. That's not the same as causing the problem. She was quiet for a moment. I just keep thinking about how Grandpa's whole plan was to word things so it didn't look like favoritism. Like the goal was never actually fairness. The goal was making sure nobody could prove it wasn't fair. She sounded, in that moment, older than 19, the particular sharpness that sometimes comes from standing just outside a family system rather than fully inside it. I don't want to be like that with my own kids someday. I want to just be honest, even if honest is messy. I told her that was, as far as I could tell, the entire lesson of the last decade, distilled by a 19-year-old on a Tuesday afternoon. That messiness honestly arrived at will always serve a family better, in the long run, than tidiness built on a lie everyone's agreed not to look at too closely.